Take a look at this graph right here. This is how much we've breathed on average at different times. If we look at 100 years ago, in the beginning of the 1900s, the first 2 decades approximately, we used to breathe 5 liters of air per minute. Now, on average, we're breathing 10 to 12 liters. Now, let me ask you a question. Have chronic disease rates gone up or down since then? They've gone up, right? And what we see, according to some Russian doctors that we're going to talk about later in the video, Buteyko if you've heard of him, is that when someone is sick, they breathe more, but when you analyze healthy people, they breathe less. And so I'm not telling you that the fact that we breathe more is the reason why we have these diseases. I'm saying that as a person gets more unhealthy and as modern society has gotten more chronic diseases, we've breathed more. And I'm also going to say, in the beginning now, that if you breathe less, you might get very, very good health effects. But you have to know how to go about this. And the best way to go about these things is to learn more about them so that you can distinguish between what is right and wrong. And everything I say in this video, you can go and fact check. You don't have to trust me. I'm only here to tell you what I think would really, really help you based on what I've seen with others, myself, and through my research. Let's begin. I'm gonna take you on a little road trip now. So I told you that overbreathing is unhealthy. You breathe too much, more air than you need to, that's overbreathing. You're breathing too much. But what does that lead to in the body? Okay, so what controls breathing? Well, you have oxygen wanting to come in, right? And then that being delivered to the cells. And then you have your cells, your mitochondria, creating CO2 through respiration. Use the oxygen and whatever it is that you're eating, glucose or fat, and that becomes water and CO2. And so that CO2 is what you're breathing out right now. Whenever you take an out breath, you're breathing out CO2, okay? So what would breathing more lead to? It would lead to you increasing your oxygen levels, right? And decreasing your CO2 levels. So is CO2 really important in the blood? It is. It is because of something called the Bohr effect, which we're going to discuss in a moment. But basically, what happens is that you become hypocapnic. You get hypocapnia. So hypocapnia means you get low CO2 levels. At first, this doesn't seem like it's a problem because you're getting high oxygen, right? And then low CO2, right? So it doesn't really matter. But here's the problem. You see, there's something called the Bohr effect, which we're going to talk more about later. But in essence, the Bohr effect is what allows for oxygenation. If you don't have enough CO2, what happens is that hemoglobin, which is the thing in your red blood cells that binds to oxygen or CO2 and takes it from the cells to the lungs, or from the lungs to the cells. Again, that's what hemoglobin is doing. Hemoglobin needs adequate CO2 levels to transport oxygen, to release oxygen, okay? Otherwise, hemoglobin will hold on to oxygen. And so you might have a really high oxygen saturation, but the oxygen is never reaching your cells because your CO2 levels are low. So hypocapnia leads to hypoxia. Now that's a new term. Hypoxia means starved of oxygen. Okay, if you hold your breath like for too long, you become hypoxic, and hypoxia eventually kills you. Now you can have pseudohypoxia, which is being just a little bit hypoxic. It's enough to, go around and live, but you won't be very healthy because you'll always be stressing out your cells by not delivering enough oxygen for them to produce energy. Which is why you need oxygen, to produce energy, right? And so now you understand that low CO2 levels means lower energy production because you're not delivering enough oxygen to your cells. So do you now realize why it is so bad to overbreathe? Yes, because you're expelling too much CO2. And CO2 is the other half of breathing. There is no breathing without CO2. It's so important that you can say it's equally as important as oxygen. It's the other half of breathing. And as you heard me say in the beginning of the video, again, if you look at heart disease, you look at a certain disease that begins with a C that cannot be mentioned, you may know why, diabetes, any chronic disease that we think about today, many other diseases, by the way, if we look at their prevalence, during the beginning of the 1900s, we don't see that they're very prevalent. Heart disease, again, I can tell you a story about heart disease. Heart disease, the guy who invented the EKG, you know, that thing that they hook you up to, and then they check sort of what your heart is doing. The guy who invented it sold the patent to Harvard for $2. He invented it in the beginning of the 1900s. And the reason why he did that is because there was not much interest in heart disease. Yet it's one of the #1 killers today. So could it be that back then, when they breathed less, they had higher CO2 levels, so hemoglobin was more likely to release the oxygen, and their mitochondria, the little engines in the cell that create your energy, they got enough oxygen to produce energy, and so there wouldn't be hypoxia. And today, when we breathe more, we have lower CO2 levels, so hemoglobin is holding on to more oxygen and not giving it to our cells, and so we're producing less energy, and maybe, just maybe, that is linked to our modern problems. And maybe CO2 is a health marker, okay? And I'd argue that if you increase your CO2 levels, you're most likely gonna get a lot healthier. Why do we breathe? Because we need oxygen. Now, why do we need oxygen? We need it because of the reversal of photosynthesis, right? That's what animals do. So photosynthesis is then that we take CO2 and water and we create oxygen and then sugar or energy that's stored, chemically speaking. And then as consumers, as animals, we do the reverse of that. We take some kind of energy in the form of humans. It would be, well, sugar or fat together with oxygen. And out of that, we create CO2 and water that the plants use once more. Or actually, we use the water mostly. We also use the CO2. But then eventually, we are going to excrete both. And that goes to the plants. Well, so then we gained a few pieces of information. We know that in terms of what we're eating, we're using oxygen together with that, right? We're using oxygen together with that to produce CO2 and water. So then now we may understand that the oxygen we are breathing is becoming CO2 and then water. So then how is it becoming CO2 and water? How is it being incorporated into these new molecules? A lot of the oxygen you breathe is becoming water inside of you. How is that happening? Well, you have to understand how the electron transport chain works, because that's really where oxygen is used. It's used in the mitochondria in a place called cytochrome C oxidase. And so let's look at the mitochondria first of all. In the mitochondria you have an outer membrane, okay? Then you have an inner membrane. So you have two membranes. So imagine one big bag and then one smaller bag inside the bigger bag. So then you have between them the intermembrane space, the space between the two membranes, right? And then you have the matrix, which is inside the inner mitochondrial membrane. So in the inner mitochondrial membrane, in the membrane, you have the electron transport chain, which is you transporting electrons from one place to the other. And this flow of electrons, this electricity, is what leads to the production of energy, okay? So the electrons are tunneling through like this, through 5 or 4 complexes. Then the 5th complex is doing something that's a bit different, but we mainly want to focus on these 4 complexes. So the electrons are going here, right? They're going from the 1st complex to the 3rd complex to the 4th complex, or the 2nd complex to the 3rd complex to the 4th complex. So what does that mean? That means that in the 1st complex, basically, you use that if you're eating carbohydrates, you use the 2nd complex if you're eating fat. When you're fasting, when you're in ketosis, you're using the 2nd complex. When you're eating a lot of sugar, fruits, etc., you're using the 1st complex. And so you never go through both, you go through one of them. And that's not the Randall cycle, but that's sort of related to the Randall cycle, if you know about that. So, after the electron has passed into the 4th complex, it has nowhere to go, really. Like, where does it go? We're talking about an electron transport chain, right? And so these electrons are being transported somewhere. But who is accepting them? What's the end point here? The end point is oxygen, okay? So oxygen has a very big role here because it is the thing that ends the electron transport chain. It is the thing that accepts these electrons to not allow them to go everywhere and just wreak havoc, really. You're gonna electrocute yourself if you don't have oxygen. Those electrons are just gonna jump everywhere and create a bunch of problems for you. They're going to bind to certain places in the cell, thus destroying them, okay? You need to keep them in check. So who is doing that? Oxygen is. And so oxygen accepts these electrons and produces water. Fantastic, isn't it? So all this oxygen that you're breathing is becoming water in cytochrome C oxidase, or the fourth complex. Now I told you there's a fifth complex, that is the ATP synthase, that's your spinning hydrogen gun. And that thing, that's the guy producing ATP. The other guys, they're making sure that he can produce ATP. Okay, that's what the electron transport chain is doing. Basically, it's creating a big fat dam, lots of hydrogen over here, less hydrogen over here, and so the hydrogen wants to go to the other side, right? And they go through the fifth complex. And that makes it spin really fast, and that makes it create ATP. So, that is why you breathe. That might have seemed complex, hopefully it wasn't, but that is why you breathe. You breathe so that the electrons have somewhere to go. The oxygen is pulling, because it's very electronegative. It's pulling the electrons through to it. From, them going from this first complex to the fourth complex. If they didn't want to go to oxygen, if they preferred the third complex more, they would never go to oxygen. They'd just stay in the third complex. But as they go, there is a higher likelihood of the electron jumping to the next place as long as the mitochondria is healthy. This oxygen becomes water, which is absolutely amazing because this is the absolute most important hydration you could ever get. The water you create in your own body, and I went over this in this video right here. Now all of this might seem abstract to you. Oh, these complexes and this ATP synthase, this hydrogen, what does this have to do with health? Well, if this process is going well for you in the brain, then when you read books, for example, or you're thinking, you can think very clearly. You can read the book very easily. You can understand stuff. You don't need to reread 5 times. You don't suddenly get this feeling of, oh, what did I just read? You zoned out while reading and then you have to reread it. That happens way less and you can read faster. Now let's say you eat something, it just sits in your stomach, it just continues to sit in your stomach and you really feel like your digestion is bad. Well, could it be that the mitochondria, this entire process that I spoke of, and more, that isn't working quite well? You can't produce enough gastric acid. Now, gastric acid, to produce that, you need energy, right? And so if your mitochondria aren't producing enough energy, are you going to digest stuff well? No, probably won't. And you're going to see that some people who change their breathing and increase their CO2 levels, they actually do get great results in terms of digestion, which is very surprising, at least, when you hear it the first time. Energy drives your entire body. Energy drives your entire life. Whatever it is that you want, whether it's just health or to use this health to enable human flourishing, to do what it is that you want to do in the world and make the world a better place, for that to happen, you need your mitochondria to work well. And so if there's anything going on in terms of hypoxia, in terms of oxygen or CO2, that's bad. If this process that I described, if that isn't working, then you're going to experience symptoms, you won't be healthy, and so that will be your focus instead of focusing on your dreams. And if none of that resonated with you, everyone wants to be attractive usually, everyone wants to have great skin. But it doesn't seem to me, like many people talk about, that the fact that the mitochondrial capacity in the skin, the energy available for the organ that is the skin to use, is what determines how good the skin is gonna look. So if you're hypoxic, will your skin look good? Probably not. If you have some mitochondrial issues. If you have mitochondrial issues, will your skin look good? No. And so if you have acne or dermatitis, psoriasis, there's a mitochondrial issue. So now that you know why we breathe, you need to understand the 2 rules that govern how we breathe, that control breathing. And these are the Bohr effect and the Haldane effect. The hemoglobin is like the girl, and everyone else is like the guys. And all the guys are competing for the hemoglobin, right? And so let me ask you a question. If you only have oxygen in the blood, will anything be competing for that bond, the bond to hemoglobin? No, nothing will be competing, okay? So the bond is gonna stay. You need to knock off the bond somehow. And the way you do that is by having other things that want to bind to hemoglobin. You need competition. And so CO2 is one of these things. Protons are one of these things. And then certain acids are also one of these things. And thankfully, you know, having higher CO2 levels in the blood, those create certain acids in the blood. That's why your pH goes down when you have higher CO2 levels. Now, that it depends. Like if you have really high CO2 levels, then you're gonna get acidosis, but just having healthy CO2 levels will never cause any issues. Because again, otherwise they wouldn't be healthy CO2 levels. Otherwise they would be too high, and we don't want that, obviously. So, having that competes for the hemoglobin, making it so that oxygen says, okay, I can't stay here, and then, you know, it goes off to the mitochondria, where we need them, okay? Because of this, if you do, let's say, the Wim Hof method, which is hyperventilation in the beginning, what you're doing is basically the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect states that CO2 levels have an influence on oxygen levels. So, if you have high CO2 levels, you're going to have more oxygenation because hemoglobin is gonna release the oxygen. While if you have very low CO2 levels, you'll have high oxygen tensions, but not much oxygenation. That's basically the Bohr effect for you. Now, the Haldane effect is sort of the opposite of that. In the Bohr effect, it is CO2 that's controlling the behavior of oxygen. In the Haldane effect, it is oxygen controlling the behavior of CO2. Likewise, if you have high oxygen levels, you're most likely going to have low CO2 levels, right? And if you have low oxygen levels, you're most likely going to have high CO2 levels. So as you can see, oxygen is also something that regulates and predicts what CO2 is doing. It's going to predict how much CO2 saturation and CO2 usage you're going to have in any particular tissue. So the Bohr effect shows you what oxygen is doing based on CO2. The Haldane effect, basically what CO2 is doing based on oxygen. Okay? So those are the two rules that regulate breathing. So now, what's the real problem in terms of overbreathing? We said that overbreathing leads to low CO2 levels. So now you might understand that that means that we have, you know, a lot of oxygen bound to hemoglobin, but that our tissues aren't really using the oxygen because that's dependent on our CO2 levels, isn't it? Oxygenation is dependent on our CO2 levels. So we overbreathe, we get lower CO2 levels, we become hypocapnic, we get hypocapnia, low CO2 levels, and that causes hypoxia because we're not delivering oxygen to the mitochondria. Now, here's a question. What happens if we don't get enough oxygen to the mitochondria? Well, I told you that you need oxygen to accept the electrons and the electron transport chain. So if you don't have as much oxygen, then the electron transport chain is going to be slower, most likely. It's not going to be as effective because there's not enough oxygen to provide a space for all those electrons to go. So then it has to slow down. One of the things that can happen is that these electrons get stuck in the complexes. Now what happens then? If it gets stuck in the complexes, oxygen, you know, it doesn't have to go to complex 4. It can also go to the other complexes. It will just go wherever there are a lot of electrons because they both want each other. So one is attracting the other, right? So say they're stuck in complex 1 or complex 3, for example. What happens? Well, then you have a bunch of electrons that are building up here because it's just too slow, isn't it? And then oxygen comes here instead. So then what happens? That's how you create free radicals, isn't it? So what are free radicals? Free radicals are these compounds that are very, very reactive, and if we don't do anything about them, they can cause a lot of damage. Sometimes they are necessary. I go over this in the cold exposure video, and we're gonna talk about that in a moment. But at other times, they are very problematic, okay? And so in general, mitochondrial dysfunction tends to make it so that we produce more free radicals. Now, free radicals are very reactive. So what they'll do is they'll bind to some place, let's say some complex, and then completely break this complex and now there's no electron transport chain. Or maybe they bind to some place in the membrane, which tells the entire mitochondria to kill itself. And the mitochondria are actually the control centers for whether the cell kills itself, okay? So, what could happen is that you just drastically weaken your mitochondria by being hypoxic, by creating more free radicals, right? Or the entire cell could just kill itself, okay? And so, if, let's say, you're wearing AirPods, this is happening. You're creating more free radicals, but for other reasons. You are making yourself hypoxic, but for other reasons, because of other mechanisms. And that kills the cell through the same mechanism. So you're degrading your brain by doing that. So if you're doing that right now, you know what to do, my friend. So hypoxia creates mitochondrial dysfunction and thus also inflammation through that mechanism that I just described, through creating more free radicals. And another thing that happens is that energy drops. You don't create as much energy. And so, will you have brain fog if you overbreathe? Yes. Do people with open mouths, so people who mouth breathe, do they overbreathe? Naturally, because you're not supposed to breathe through the mouth and you're going to expel way too much CO2? Yes. Yes, that's why usually we don't associate mouth breathing people with very intelligent people. Because they're completely abusing the Bohr effect. They're hypoxic, okay? And so their brain doesn't work. But again, poor digestion, this, that, just many problems in general, you can link them to breathing because of this. Because what has a huge effect on your mitochondria? Well, practically everything in your environment and also breathing. Breathing is just another one that can mess them up. So you have to be really careful. But hypoxia isn't the only thing you get when you have low CO2 levels. So hypocapnia, again, which is low CO2 levels, which leads to poor oxygenation, that leads to other things. CO2 is also a vasodilator. And a vasodilator improves blood flow. It makes blood flow better. It doesn't constrict the capillaries, it opens up the capillaries and allows for blood flow. A vasoconstrictor would do that. Low CO2 is a vasoconstrictor. CO2 is a vasodilator. So if you lack it, or if you're breathing out too much, or if your mitochondria aren't producing enough of it, you'll have vasoconstriction. Now, do you think the blood flow to your brain is going to be as good? No. So may that be a reason why someone who mouth breathes may not have the best cognitive performance, cognitive ability? Yes, 100%. It's also something that signals to your body whether you're in a sympathetic nervous system state or a parasympathetic state. So these are two parts of our autonomic nervous system. And this is the nervous system that, we can't control. So parasympathetic would be equivalent with rest and digest. And sympathetic would be fight or flight. Okay, so this would mean that you're stressed. I mean, you'd need this if you're trying to save someone's life, for example. You need a little bit of this. Or when you're driving, you need a little bit of this so that, you're aware of what you're doing. But most of the time, when you're just eating, doing standard activities, you want to be in the parasympathetic state. Now, if you're exercising, you're running, what are you going to do? You're going to breathe a lot, right? So you're most likely going to go more toward the sympathetic nervous system state, not just because of your breathing, but for other reasons as well. But when you're meditating, for example, or you're trying to go to sleep, I'd probably say that they're the same thing, to be honest with you. At least in my experience, once you've meditated for a while. What happens is that you want to be in a parasympathetic state, right? But if we observe the action is to breathe less. Usually when you're meditating and you're focusing on the breath, you don't breathe faster over time, you breathe slower over time. Same thing when you're going to bed, you breathe slowly. If you suddenly start hyperventilating, you become stressed. Why? Because hypocapnia leads to stress. So if you have low CO2 levels, that will stress you out. The pH of your blood is supposed to be at a very narrow range with very narrow margins, so it can't change much. So this entire, your blood is supposed to be more alkaline, acid, this, that. That's not true. None of that. It's a very tight range, okay? Now, it does change the things in your body and the environment that regulate the pH. So there are things, let's say you increase the alkalinity. Now your body has to bring the alkalinity down, and so it needs to use resources to do that. Let's say it becomes more acid, your body needs to use resources to make it more alkaline, right? And so if for some reason, because your health is not good, you have something going on that's making it so that your blood is steadily being pushed toward one or the other directions, you're going to need a buffer. You're going to use more of the buffer. And so having low CO2 levels, that depletes, as far as I know, magnesium and calcium. Why? Because you're making the blood more alkaline. CO2 makes the blood more acidic, and it's supposed to be at a certain level, which makes it good, right? Well, if you have low CO2 levels, your blood is too alkaline, you need to push it down, you use calcium and magnesium, it seems. So what are the benefits of having higher CO2 levels? Well, it's just the opposite of what I just listed. You get parasympathetic nervous system activation, it calms you down. Again, you meditate, you don't hyperventilate, you breathe less. You're calm, you're usually breathing less. And so, what's funny is that if you start breathing less when you're stressed, you can actually calm down faster. And if you breathe less in general, and you were breathing more than you should before, then you're going to become even calmer. Wonderful, isn't it? You also get vasodilation, which means it improves your blood flow. Your blood flows better to your brain, your extremities, your organs, and that can fix, in many cases, it can change your complexion. You might have had a very bad complexion. Now suddenly your face is much fuller, you get better blood flow to the skin, maybe your gut starts working better because, again, CO2 regulates quite a few things in the gut. It also is a free radical scavenger. It's an antioxidant, okay? So it specifically acts on, as far as I know, reactive nitrogen species. So there are reactive oxygen species, so oxygen byproducts that just want to latch onto something and create some cascade of electrons moving from thing to thing and that just blowing up everything. That's the way I would describe it. The same thing can happen with nitrogen, so you can get reactive nitrogen species. And carbon dioxide can neutralize those, which protects your mitochondria. So higher CO2 levels are protective of the mitochondria. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And you can protect your mitochondria then by breathing less. But ultimately, this leads to you not being hypoxic or pseudo-hypoxic, which is sort of, you're delivering oxygen. You're not fully hypoxic, the tissue isn't dying, but you're doing it suboptimally, so you're still getting symptoms. You're still not healthy. The tissue is not functioning as it's supposed to. And this is what we see in modern society. We see massive pseudo-hypoxia. Credit to Dr. Jack Kruse for talking about this. Actually, we're going to discuss some of his work later on and how it relates to this. But for the meantime, know that higher CO2 levels, breathing less, leads to mitochondrial efficiency. Why? Again, you have oxygen coming in, the electron flow works well, you have adequate free radical scavenging, you're just creating more energy efficiency inside the human body. It's supposed to have a certain level of CO2, you're providing that. CO2 is supposed to do certain things, you're providing that. Now, who is the god, the prophet of breathing? It is Dr. Konstantin Buteyko. And what I love about this man is that there's no controversy around him, at least from what I've seen. His work is just solid. You can't argue with it. Dr. Konstantin Buteyko was a doctor, talking 50s, 60s in Russia. That's mostly when he did his work on breathing, as far as I understand. And he observed that sick patients breathe more, while healthy people breathe less. So he went, okay, well, how about I go ahead and restore the breathing of these people? He studied the physiology, obviously. He knew the physiology. He went, okay, well, they're sort of abusing the Bohr effect. Let me fix that. Let's make them breathe less. So he'd make them breathe less, and what happens is that they feel better, right? So how do you even track that progress? How do you track that progress? What is the method? Well, that's when you get into Buteyko breathing, and I'm going to go over that as well as I can. The first main thing you have to understand is that you can actually measure your CO2 tolerance, how well you're doing in terms of CO2. And your CO2 tolerance reflects how good your CO2 levels are in the lungs and also in the blood, how much you can handle. Because what you have to realize is that if you've had low CO2 levels for a very long period of time, what happens is that you get used to that, your body gets used to that. So suddenly, if you want to push it to normal CO2 levels, let's say by holding your breath, you're not going to be able to do that. So you have to train yourself. It's a slow process. And once you get to the finish line, you'll be more like you're actually supposed to be as a human being. You reclaim more of what is your birthright, which is health. Okay, so that is the process we're working on. It's not something artificial. The way you test it is through the control pause. So the control pause is, I'll explain it as best as I can. Basically, you should have not eaten. You should have not done any vigorous exercise. Usually you do it in the morning for consistency. So you wake up in the morning, you haven't done any vigorous exercise, you haven't eaten, okay? You can drink water if you want to. You sit in a relaxed manner. You don't change your breathing. You just breathe completely normally, okay? Then, you're going up and down and up and down in terms of your breathing. You're not extending, you're not taking an in-breath that's larger or an out-breath that's longer. You're never changing anything. You're just breathing completely normally. Then, on your natural exhale, at the end point of your exhale, you start holding. Okay? You start holding. Then you count the amount of time without looking at the clock. You count the amount of time that you can hold your breath on the exhale, on the natural exhale. So no bigger inhale before, just a natural exhale. You can lay down on the ground, sit down, whatever you want to do. You count the time to which you feel like you want to take the first breath. So this doesn't mean pushing it, because pushing it would mean that you've already passed that point, right? That's the point where you're struggling because you're past that point. What I'm talking about is the first real sign of you wanting to breathe. Usually there's some contraction here, or you feel like, oh, I really want to breathe. The muscles all over your core sort of contract, or you just feel, oh, yeah, I want to breathe. So then you let go and you pause the timer. Stop the timer. And what you see is your control pause. So then that means that we can sort of compare control pauses and see, okay, how is this person doing? How healthy is he? And what's his control pause? And what you see is that the control pause in most healthy people, and also what it was 100 years ago, is 40 seconds and above. 40 seconds and above is what you should aim for. So what does this mean? This means that you wake up in the morning, you're breathing normally, and on the exhale, you can hold it for 40 seconds without feeling any urge to breathe. And yes, that is how it's supposed to be. You may do this and only get 5 seconds. Then you have an issue. Then this video is really important. Before we look at Buteyko's studies, what is his method? What is he making his patients do? What is it that people do when they do Buteyko breathing? Because obviously if there's something called Buteyko breathing, then it's some special kind of thing you do with your breath. Quite simple. You breathe less until you feel an air hunger, like you need to breathe more air in. And you maintain that. And that increases your CO2 tolerance and also your CO2 levels. That's what it is. And you can do this through a light air hunger, which you maintain throughout the day, or you can be more hardcore and you can maintain a light air hunger throughout the day and also have a session where you deliberately breathe less, but you create a moderate air hunger or a strong air hunger. Now obviously you begin with a light air hunger, but then you can move on to a moderate or stronger air hunger. You can also do breath holds, but what I've seen people talk about in this space of Buteyko breathing and reduced breathing is that those can be problematic if you have pre-existing conditions. Your blood pressure can go up a lot, you can feel like your heart is beating super strong. And what's important to realize is that you're not breathing less than a human being should to get some special effect. And this is not something unnatural. If you look at isolated and primitive tribes, although Buteyko never did any studies on them, you'd see that they're breathing this way. 100 years ago, you'll see that people were breathing in this way as well. All you're doing is normalizing your breathing. You're getting standard CO2 levels for a human being who is healthy. And you're doing it through breathing exercises, but you can also do it through other ways as well. You can raise your CO2 just by changing the stuff you do health-wise. Khorosho, 1982, that's our first study. And you can judge based on what I'm gonna present here. So, you had 50 patients with severe bronchial asthma, high blood pressure, so hypertension, and angina pectoris, so painful contractions of the heart, you could say. And usually people with angina also have pain sort of at the shoulder and the arm because of these heart issues, and the rib cage in general. 95% success rate with reduced breathing. And if I'm not mistaken, although the study is in Russian, what I do believe when I saw the translation in English, someone translating it, someone who's prominent in the breathing community we're going to speak about in a moment, is that they basically did light air hunger for the entire day. Because they were just in their bed. They couldn't do anything really. They had severe issues. And it had a 95% success rate in drastically reducing their symptoms or reversing their problems. They went into remission. The next study we have is of 52 children. And so they have severe asthma attacks and they have really bad respiratory issues. Someone who has asthma who regularly gets attacks. Basically, you had 83% who got considerable improvement. So that means that they got really, really big improvements. Some of them, they got well. Others, they got far, far better than where they were. And then 17% got some improvement. So not full improvement, but some improvement. Then there are the notes of the Moscow and Krasnoyarsk meeting notes. So a bunch of doctors met up in 1988, and they were speaking of their experience with 3,000 patients with respiratory issues, cardiovascular issues, skeletal, digestive issues, and skin issues. So lots of issues. Now here's my favorite study. You had 50 people with Chernobyl radiation sickness, okay? 82% considerable improvement. So basically, when a study says considerable improvement, that means huge improvement. And it's improvements in blood, so blood values, cardiovascular system function, digestive function, and in the amount of medication they need to manage symptoms. And there are tons of other studies. If I were to present all of them, this section would be really long, but I hope you get a grasp of what I'm trying to show here. Breathing exercises, just normalizing CO2, which is something that our mitochondria produce naturally, is something that has significant health effects in people with low CO2. You can fix it through breathing, but also through changing your environment, as I said before. But what I would propose in this video is do both. So I have a community on school, and obviously whenever I learn something new or I'm reading something, they get to know about it. They get to ask me questions all the time, and so they know what's on my mind and what I think about certain things. If you're interested in health or anything I talk about, you should be in the community. I want you there. I want excited, health-conscious people like you. Make the decision based on whether this video or any of my videos have been helpful to you. With that said, the link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. God bless you. Many of them ask me, what about breathing? What kind of breathing do you recommend? And so what I always say is reduced breathing. And I refer them to a book. And the book is called Advanced Buteyko Breathing Exercises by Artour Rakhimov. In terms of the Russian school of breathing and in terms of Buteyko's work, in my opinion, the person who has carried the torch or is carrying the torch today is Artour Rakhimov. And his book is fantastic because it addresses how to breathe. If you can't breathe from the diaphragm, how to restore that, how to increase your control pause, how to measure your control pause, what influences it. He discusses certain issues that you might run into while doing this. He discusses many different exercises that you can do in movement, but also in stillness. He discusses a bunch of stuff, and I'd just like to give you a little bit of what he talks about. Basically, you restore breathing, you reoxygenate the tissues, and that leads to greater health. That is one of the things that he's writing about in the book. And then he shows you how, CO2 drastically affects how your digestive system works. Actually, you need enough CO2 to produce gastric acid. So if you can't digest food, if you have poor digestion and things aren't moving well, it might be because you're a over-breathing chest breather. That might be the case. I've seen this connection in people. when talking to them. I sometimes ask them about their breathing. How are you breathing when they have these kinds of symptoms? And if they go, oh, I'm chest breathing, I can't really breathe from my diaphragm, I already know they're overbreathers. He also talks about circulation and immune function. You know, you restore normal breathing. You go from a mouth breather who's overbreathing to a nose breather. And what can happen is that you produce more nitric oxide and you have higher CO2 levels, so you get double vasodilation from those two, CO2 and nitric oxide, and now your circulation is way better. And let's say you had cold hands and feet before, maybe that goes away. Maybe you had a very poor complexion, maybe that goes away. Maybe you had, let's say, hair that wasn't growing well on your legs, maybe that goes away. Anything could happen. It all depends on what consequences the low nitric oxide and low CO2 have on your specific body. He says that poor posture leads to overbreathing and a lack of good breathing in general, because it becomes harder to breathe from your diaphragm if your posture is bad. If you're very hunched over, you know, there's more pressure on this entire area. You can try it yourself. It becomes a lot harder to breathe from your diaphragm. Well, if you're upright and all this is open and relaxed, very easy to breathe to your diaphragm, from your diaphragm. He also says that stress is very bad in terms of fixing this issue of overbreathing. And the reason is because stress tends to make us less conscious of our breathing. It activates the sympathetic nervous system. And again, things feed into each other. So usually if you relax your body, you calm your mind, right? If you calm your mind, you're most likely gonna relax your body. It's the same kind of story here. If you're stressed, you're more likely to overbreathe. If you're in a sympathetic nervous system state, you're more likely to overbreathe. If you overbreathe, you're more likely to be in a sympathetic state. So they go hand in hand. It's circular motion. So you can attack the breathing, sure, but if you have other stresses in your life, those are gonna affect the breathing. So that is something to be wary of. He also talks about overeating. Overeating also has a tendency to make you overbreathe. And what I think is happening here is if you measure your CP after you've eaten, usually it drops. At least for me, that's the case. And so because you're sort of exerting your gut more, you're gonna be producing more CO2. And so if you already have a bad CO2 tolerance, you're gonna feel more out of breath. That's usually the case. You're not gonna feel like you can perform really well if you've just had a very, very big meal and overeaten. And so if you overeat, that's going to encourage you to overbreathe. Sedentary behavior also encourages overbreathing because you're more likely to have poor posture. You're more likely to not be as mindful. People who are more active, they tend to be more in connection to their body and their breath. And also, if you're very sedentary, you're most likely gonna have low CO2 levels. And the reason is because if you exercise and you do it in a correct environment, you're naturally gonna have a higher CO2 tolerance. Because why do you start breathing in the first place when you're exercising? Why do you need to breathe more when you're sprinting, for example, or running or whatever it might be? It's because you're in need of producing more energy, right? Which means you're producing more CO2. You're also consuming more oxygen. So you need to breathe in more so that you get the oxygen. You need to breathe out more to get rid of the CO2. So if you feel like you need to breathe more, you're actually mimicking what the reduced breathing does. You are creating an air hunger when you are exercising if you feel like you need more air and you need to rest. Whenever there's an air hunger, you're training your CO2 tolerance. So that's why sedentary behavior is going to lead to more overbreathing, because if you already have better CO2 levels, let's say, you're less likely to overbreathe because you're gonna feel like you need to breathe less because of your better CO2 tolerance. So I'm also saying, to some degree, that instead of exercise, you can tackle it the exact same way just by breathing less. Instead of making your mitochondria, let's say, need more oxygen and produce more CO2 for you to feel like you need to breathe more, you could simply breathe less. You could go the opposite way and accomplish the same thing. It all depends on your context and what you do in your life. If, you know, you're talking to your grandma who's bedridden and she can't walk, then maybe we should go with this route. But if you're a Romanian wrestler who is close to God, and you're very healthy and you train outside and you get lots of sunlight, yeah, I mean, you can probably do it both ways. And this is one of the distinctions between Buteyko's work and Rakhimov's work. The distinction is that Rakhimov is addressing and working with healthy people, not just, let's say, people who have health issues. Buteyko mainly worked with people who aren't healthy. That's the distinction. And so Rakhimov is also helping people who are able to do exercise, and what he has noticed in his experience, based on what he writes in the book, is that if you do diaphragmatic breathing, that's through the nose, obviously, just total nose breathing. And when you exercise, if you do, it's only through the nose. If you do that together with reduced breathing, that's how you get the fastest progress. Well, that's one way of doing it. There are several ways to skin the cat. And the best way to know exactly what he says is not to listen to me, but to read the book. By now, if you've watched a detoxification video, if you've watched a cold exposure video, I highly recommend those two, by the way, and you've been listening to this video, you should sort of know how the mitochondria work. And so if I say electron flow or the electron transport chain, you sort of have an image in your mind of how that relates to you and how you work. But I will try to explain as best as I can. So, our issue here, in terms of the mitochondria, is how much energy can they create with the least amount of damage? How can we take care of our mitochondria as best as possible? Now, how does that relate to breathing? Okay, we've talked about low CO2 levels. What does that really lead to? Because right now, we've stopped at hypoxia and energy production, and then we've linked that to symptoms. Can we go further? Yes. So let's do that again. Low CO2 levels. This leads to you abusing the Bohr effect, which means that hemoglobin do not release oxygen. So you get pseudo-hypoxia, or you could just say hypoxia, okay? Because you're still working, right? But you're a little bit hypoxic. You're not getting enough oxygen. So what happens is that the electron flow in the inner mitochondrial membrane, so again, mitochondria have two membranes, an outer membrane, then an inner membrane. And then you have the intermembrane space that is between the two membranes, and then you have the matrix, which is what occurs inside the inner mitochondrial membrane. So in the inner mitochondrial membrane, that's where you have the electron transport chain, and it creates the relationship between these two areas, the intermembrane space and the matrix. There's an electrical gradient that is created here that is the basis for how we create energy, at least as far as we understand. So that energy is created through the electrical flow of these electrons, right? These electrons going through to oxygen and then turning into water, and also partly CO2. If we're hypoxic, we get a poor electron flow. Our electron transport chain doesn't work as well. This leads to us producing less energy, but also us producing less water. If you've watched the detoxification video, or you know about Dr. Gerald Pollack's work, or you know about Dr. Jack Kruse's work, you'll know that the water is the site in the body that holds the most electrons, that holds the energy in the human body. That's the way it is. Gilbert Ling is the first person to discover this, second person that built upon Gilbert Ling's work. Well, there are many who built upon Gilbert Ling's work. And this is all, we speak about this in the detoxification video. Dr. Gerald Pollack, he did amazing work. He proved Gilbert's hypothesis right. He proved Gilbert right, and also produced absolutely amazing work. I think he deserves the Nobel Prize. I think he's one of the most intelligent people on the planet, one of the best scientists we have. He's absolutely amazing. And then Dr. Jack Kruse, best doctor on the planet, in my opinion. They all agree upon this, and it seems pretty clear, again, if you read Dr. Gerald Pollack's book, that this would be the case for the water in our body, that it's charge separated, it's in the fourth phase. And to learn more about that, you could either watch my interview with Dr. Gerald Pollack, or you could watch my water video. And I'm sorry that I'm referring you to so many videos, but this isn't an easy topic. You need to watch several videos to sort of create the map that isn't unlocked yet. But in essence, this water that the mitochondria create, that hydrates our cells. It's the most important water that we create, okay? Not just the water you drink, but also the water your mitochondria create. Both are outstandingly important in terms of hydration. So I think moving forward in this, we could say that if you have a problem with the electron transport chain, let's say because you're hypoxic, you're not going to produce as much water. And if you're producing less water, well, isn't that where the energy in the body is? Isn't that where you have the most amount of electrons? Isn't water the medium of life that allows everything, all life on this planet, to exist? It is. It is. And so dehydration is aging. Dehydration is moving toward death. So if your mitochondria aren't working well and they're not producing water, something really bad is going on. Now, what occurs here with the dropping redox is that you hurt the mitochondria. They're not working as well. They don't have enough electrons to run. There's not enough water in the cell. What happens is you get mitochondrial dysfunction, and that is how you get most modern diseases. Am I saying that they're all related to breathing? No. Am I saying that breathing is a component? Yes. If you didn't catch that, just remember, more breathing means more free radicals. More free radicals means more damage to the mitochondria. More damage to the mitochondria means whatever goal you have in life, you're going away from that. Whatever thing you're trying to fix in terms of your health situation is probably going to get worse. So breathe less. Now that we've spoken about how breathing works, which is, again, the entire foundation of this video. Without it, this section would, in my opinion, be meaningless. Helpful, but meaningless. We can start to talk about how to breathe correctly as a human being. And number one is to breathe through your nose. That one's obvious, nasal breathing. Okay, but why? Why is that? Well, when you breathe through your nose, you humidify, you warm, and you filter the air. You also produce nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, which helps blood flow, which helps deliver the oxygen to where it's supposed to go. And you lose way less water. If you breathe through your mouth, you're not going to do any of those things. The amount of oxygen and CO2 you get in and you expel is going to be wrong because you're designed to breathe through your nose. And you're going to be expelling way more water. You're going to get a dry mouth. It's not going to be good for your gums, for your teeth, and you're also going to get dehydrated. It doesn't end there. You see, there is the work of Dr. Mike Mew and Dr. John Mew on tongue posture. Tongue posture drastically influences development and also any human in general, because that is the correct anatomical position for the tongue. You have connections going from the bones of the skull and also what the muscles are doing in the face that affect certain nerves. And these nerves being affected influences the rest of the body. For example, I recall that in the book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price, there was this young man with Down syndrome who had the behavior, according to Price, of a 3-year-old. He was playing with toy cars and wasn't able to do anything that was adult-like. Weston A. Price did a surgery on him that sort of moved his maxilla in such a way where it started pushing on one of the nerves and also a part of the brain, I believe, the lower part of the brain. And suddenly, this young man's development began. And his face completely changed and his behavior completely changed. And suddenly he went from a 3-year-old to being able to get groceries and being attracted to women and understanding social context. What's going on in the skull has a massive impact on what goes on in the nervous system, and the nervous system has a massive impact on everything else in your body, really. So the tongue exerting pressure on the maxilla, which is this bone right here behind the nose, and also you count the top row of the teeth as the maxilla as well, if I'm not mistaken. The pressure that comes from there affects the brain and the nerves, and that affects the rest of the body. Of course it's going to. It's the same thing if we remove your clothes, for example, and we remove the pressure from your clothes, you may feel better. One of the reasons why could be thermoregulation or light exposure, but another thing could be that you're simply not activating nerves that are not supposed to be activated. I mean, no other animal has something tight around them. During development and also as an adult human being, your maxilla needs support so that it can grow forward and upward. That's where you want your maxilla to go, forward and upward. And when you look at attractive people, that's usually where their maxilla is. If you look at their face from the side, I won't go into too much detail, but basically a forward grown maxilla is a hallmark of, well, most people who are attractive, and it is the way we usually develop in a natural environment, devoid of anything that would hinder development. For this to happen, we are in need of having the tongue at the roof of the mouth. Otherwise, the maxilla can drop. Now, not only that, we need strong masseter muscles as well. That also keeps the mandible and also the maxilla being pushed forward. It supports the bones in the face. How can I explain this in another way? If I suddenly remove the muscles from your legs, you won't be able to stand. What happens to the bones? They go from, you standing up like this, say this is the knee, to you just collapsing, right? Without the muscles. Now, that would also happen without me removing your muscles. If we make them too weak, the bone structure that is the case when you're standing cannot hold itself up. That cannot be the case. So, if we do the same thing with the face, if we make the muscles too weak, naturally the maxilla will change its position, the zygomatic bones will change their position, the orbital bones will change their position, the ramus will be displaced, the maxilla will be displaced, everything will be displaced. The entire skull will look different, and that is what you see in less attractive people. So how do we fix this? You keep the tongue at the roof of the mouth, and this automatically makes you a nose breather, because when the tongue is in the correct anatomical position, you can only breathe through the nose. So mouth breathing isn't just about the breathing itself, it's also about development, it's also about the nerves you activate, what systems in the body you activate. But another thing to add is that if you breathe through your mouth, obviously you're expelling more CO2 than you should. That activates the sympathetic nervous system and you get stressed. Number 2 is breathing from your diaphragm. So I want you to do something with me. I want you to put your hand on your chest, in the middle of your chest, like this. I can't touch my mic, but you can put your hand flat on your chest. I'll put it here so that you don't hear a weird scratchy sound. And I want you to breathe. And if your chest moves forward or your shoulders change their position, you are breathing incorrectly. If your chest doesn't move, if your upper body doesn't move, and it is only the belly that is being inflated, so your diaphragm, then you are breathing correctly. That's diaphragmatic breathing. Now, why should you breathe from your diaphragm? Well, because it inflates the lower part of the lungs. And the lower part of the lungs are 7 times more effective than the upper parts. And effective in terms of what? Gas exchange. Okay, so they're 7 times better at moving oxygen and CO2 than the upper part of the lungs. And if you're breathing from your chest, you're losing out on that because you're not inflating the lower part of the lungs. This means that if you breathe from your diaphragm, you require less air because you're breathing more effectively. That's the real gem here. Not only that, there are other benefits. One such is that you activate your parasympathetic nervous system. Breathing from your diaphragm relaxes you. So that's yet another benefit. If you have high cortisol, you're stressed, breathe slowly and from your diaphragm. Wait, I might be skipping ahead there. We're going to discuss tempo in a moment. The diaphragm is also a lymphatic pump. So it creates a negative pressure, a sort of suction on this area of the body. And obviously your lymphatic system is your second circulatory system in the body. It just doesn't have a central pump like the heart. The blood, this cardiovascular system has the heart. The lymphatic system is the same thing, but it doesn't have a central heart. It has lymph nodes and it relies on gravity. It relies on electromagnetism, Dr. Gerald Pollack's work, and movement in general, muscles moving the lymph because they exert pressure on them. And then another thing to add is just observe people. The people who are, let's say, smokers or cough a lot or have bad respiratory fitness, usually they're chest breathers. Sick people in general, usually they're chest breathers. While when you look at people who are healthy, you naturally see that they breathe from their diaphragm and their chest doesn't move. They've even known this in the Zen tradition. When they talk about how you should meditate in Zen, I believe in the Rinzai Zen school more specifically, they say your chest isn't supposed to move, it's only the diaphragm that's supposed to move. Now where does that wisdom come from? Observation, close observation, master to master, master to master. This being passed down as ancient knowledge in well, I would guess it would be Japan and China. The third principle is to breathe less, okay? So you don't necessarily have to create an air hunger. That's what you do when you're practicing and you're very motivated and you're trying to gain higher CO2 levels, which I definitely encourage. But if you don't want to feel uncomfortable for any particular reason, or you're trying to focus on something else, or you're just trying to calm down and you don't want to do some exercise, although I think the exercise would calm you down, this breathing exercise that I'm talking about, reduced breathing, whenever you're breathing and you want to breathe more correctly, see if you can lessen the amount of air that you take in. So you're breathing through your nose right now, right? Well, make the inhale shorter, inhale less, and make the exhale longer. And now you're breathing less air. And you might just notice while you're reading or doing something else that, oh, probably breathing too much. Let me lessen that. The fourth breathing principle is the exhale. The exhale is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. The inhale is part of the sympathetic nervous system. So if we want to think about it in terms of mathematics, you want the exhale to be longer than the inhale to have an overall calming effect on the nervous system. If you do the opposite, well then you're going to have more sympathetic nervous system activation as opposed to parasympathetic, and so you're going to become more sympathetic. Not in terms of what the word usually means, but in terms of what your nervous system is doing. So make sure the exhale is longer than the inhale, because the slower you exhale, the more you relax. And you can even feel this. Like if you're going to really relax your body, you usually go, you take in a big breath and then you relax on the exhale. The fifth and last breathing principle is that it's supposed to be effortless and light. Why? When you're unconscious of your breathing, which is, during many activities we're unconscious of our breathing, it's effortless and light. If it wasn't, you'd notice it. You'd notice it all the time, right? If you're out of breath for some reason, you'll notice the breath all the time. But if it's effortless and light, or you're unconscious of it, then that has to be the case. If you're unconscious of it, it's effortless and light. So when you're practicing breathing, or you're trying to breathe more effectively, you don't want to take in very strong inhales or very strong exhales that you can hear. You want them to be as light and unnoticeable as possible. And what you see during meditation, for example, something that the Buddhists have observed, is that when you're meditating, usually your breath gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And some people have the issue of not even being able to feel the breath after a while, because their mind becomes so refined and the breathing becomes so light because of the internal state you're creating. We could add one more thing, and it's the sixth thing that relates to the internal state and not to the, let's say, breathing physiology itself, but you have the awareness of the breath, which is still part of the body, because consciousness must have its basis from the body, and the body also has its basis in consciousness. Now that's something you can think about as a koan if you want to. In modern society, and again, even the health conscious people that I meet, most of them, when I ask anyone, do you think a lot? Or do you have a calm mind? They say, my mind is racing, I think a lot. Anyone. I haven't asked a single person who replied, no, I don't think that much. No one. No one at all. Okay? And so, in terms of the work I've done, I'm an anomaly. But the Buddhists, any Buddhist out there, or anyone who's done consciousness practice or a lot of meditation, knows exactly what I'm talking about, or someone who knows about Eckhart Tolle's work. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is, to fix this issue, be aware of the breath as much as possible throughout the day. Not only will you be able to apply these 5 principles, increase your CO2 levels, and become a healthier human being, you can also tackle the mind at the same time. Because when you're feeling the breath, not only can you calm yourself down, you're also aware of the breath as opposed to your racing mind. You may notice that if you focus on the breath, You can't think, you can't create more thoughts, at least it's harder. You're more in control of the thoughts you create. You're more in control of emotion. You're more in control and present in your experience. So be aware of the breath as much as you can, and trust me, it has a profound effect. Now we're going to address breath work, but I want you to notice something. As I go through the breath work, you're going to feel like your understanding of all of these methods that I'm going to speak about is far greater than it used to be. Why? Because you understand the physiology of breathing now. That's why we go over this. That's why my videos are longer. It should be clear that in terms of breath work, if you want to keep it simple, the best thing is just to do reduced breathing. Just do that, because it works. If you look into the studies, so you have cited a few studies here. If you look into it deeper or further, you'll find that Buteyko has a ton of studies, and even after his death, we've continuously used his method in clinical trials and gotten great success. And it also works for individuals. So you don't take my word for it. Don't even look at the studies if you don't want to. Try it out yourself and see if it works. And I can tell you that based on the physiology, reduced breathing is a really good idea, as long as you're in a natural environment, but we're going to get to that. So how do you do reduced breathing? We've already gone over this, but I'm going to sort of talk about it in the way I understand it. Basically, you're breathing in the way you're breathing right now. Obviously, the way you breathe needs to be right. It needs to be through the nose, and it needs to be through the diaphragm, and hopefully you're relaxed. You relax the body, you calm yourself down, because if you're very stressed, you're going to naturally want to breathe more, and your diaphragm is going to be tense, and it's not going to be the best of situations. So you basically want to create a light air hunger. So this isn't something where you feel like you're super out of breath. You feel like you could take in a little bit more air. That is what you're maintaining, and you're making sure that the exhale is longer than the inhale, and that the inhales are smaller in general. Now, there are many details we could go over here, but in general, what tends to happen is that you're going to take more breaths per minute. Some people might not do this because they have, a great respiratory system. But you may feel, perhaps if you're older or, you got into health like a month ago, that you need to take more breaths, and this is fine. All that's important is that you're creating a light air hunger. That's all, and that your breathing is correct. It's from the nose and the diaphragm as much as you possibly can. Now, that's the basics. You can do this as much as you want throughout the day. Then you have moderate air hunger. You basically increase the air hunger, make it stronger. Like you could hold your breath to max and then try to do reduced breathing, and then maintain a very strong air hunger. The only thing that needs to be commented on, I think, is that one, you can overtrain, and two, you need to be able to do it in a relaxed manner. You don't want to tense up the diaphragm because that's going to mess up your breathing. So that's why usually you'd start with light air hunger first and then move on to moderate. And then once you're practicing moderate, you'll still want to do light, like in different sessions. And the reason is because will you be able to do moderate air hunger while having a relaxed core? That's the thing. So you need to practice that. You can go even stronger. You could do a very strong air hunger where you feel like you really need to take in a breath, but you maintain that by breathing really slowly. Maybe you're taking 3 breaths per minute, who knows. But I wouldn't recommend this if you have, again, let's say we're talking about my mother, and my mother asks me, should I do very strong air hunger? And let's say she has some kind of respiratory issue, let's say she has heart disease. I would say, no, if I were you, I would do light breathing, a light air hunger. I wouldn't do anything strong. Strong is only once you've progressed and you feel like you have no symptoms, you're not running into any issues, and overall, you have no noticeable bad things that could go wrong when you do this. Like there are people who hold their breath and their heart starts racing, or they get lightheaded. Well, then you know that you're not one of these people, for example. And a quick mention before we talk about overtraining is that most of these things in terms of the, severe air hunger, strong air hunger, medium, doing it with exercise, which we're going to discuss in a moment, and even the overtraining, that's all in Artour's book, in Artour Rakhimov's book, Advanced Buteyko Breathing Exercises. So I'd like to mention him once again. And that is where I learned this stuff from. you can get overtraining once you go beyond, let's say, the light stuff, okay? If you do medium for like 2 hours, 3 hours every day, maybe you'll run into issues. If you do severe for an hour, you're definitely gonna get issues. When you get to the stronger stuff, you don't want to do more than 20 minutes to 30 minutes. And it's gonna depend on the person, but this is just an average, okay? So if you wanna be safe, light stuff always works. If you wanna push it more and get faster results, progress through them and keep the diaphragm relaxed. Now, what are the symptoms of overtraining? Well, 2 of them are that you're going to feel like your breathing muscles are a bit fatigued. You're gonna feel like your diaphragm is tense and, you know, just doesn't feel good. And your controlled pause will go down by quite a lot, I'm pretty sure. And so if those things happen to you, you've overtrained. Just breathe normally and you'll recover most likely. One of my personal favorites is this one, which is doing reduced breathing or just nasal breathing, depending on the intensity of the exercise, together with movement. So let's say you're walking, you can do reduced breathing during the walking. Now, naturally, you exert yourself more when you're walking as opposed to just relaxing, and so it will be easier to reach an air hunger, and so maybe you'll have a medium air hunger doing what you usually do with the light stuff in terms of the breathing. So this also conditions you sort of to breathe less during activity, which is going to be what you're doing throughout the day anyway. So being able to breathe less in any situation is better than just doing it in a specific session. It's like meditation. You want the meditation to carry over to your life, and so you have to keep the concentration, the unification of the mind that you've built up during the meditation, right? So it's the same thing with breathing. You don't just want to do it in a session, you want to do it all the time if you want great results and if you want to carry over to your life. Now, let's say you're a football player or a tennis player. What you want is, well, let's say you reach the point where you want to breathe through your mouth, fight that and continue breathing through your nose, okay? Because you're going to force your body to have higher CO2 levels. It's gonna be uncomfortable, but just continue breathing through your nose. And if you do this, you'll eventually be able to do exercise just by breathing through your nose. Me, I've reached that stage. And it also requires a little bit of pain tolerance, but that will naturally go away as your CO2 tolerance goes higher. And actually, higher CO2 tolerance, well, let's think about this. Okay, so why do you get out of breath? Well, because you're creating a lot of CO2 and you need a lot of oxygen, and so you're putting demand on your mitochondria or on your respiratory system. And if that's not being met, your body's gonna tell you, wait a moment, we're creating too much CO2, there's too much demand, can't do this. If you're very unhealthy, that will happen when you're walking up the stairs. But if you're really healthy, you have a high CO2 tolerance, your cardiovascular system is really good, your mitochondria are really good, you're going to be able to do a lot more physical work without reaching that point, right? And so increasing your CO2 tolerance also has major performance benefits. And of course, think about any primitive or isolated human. Their performance is amazing. And so you must realize that performance is tied to health. If you can't walk up the stairs, you are not healthy. The next one is the absolute most relaxed version, and it is slow meditative breathing, because it doesn't involve an air hunger per se. You could create an air hunger, but that's usually not advised. So the most standard meditation is just to observe the breath. Keep your attention on the breath. Hopefully sort of the background environment as well, but mostly the breath, right? And so usually what happens is that the breath becomes softer and you breathe deeper, you breathe more properly. You're breathing obviously through the nose and you're filling up your belly, and hopefully your chest isn't moving either. And again, you're breathing more slowly, your exhale is longer. So naturally, just by meditating, most people go toward more correct breathing, because more correct breathing is related to relaxation, and meditation usually leads to relaxation, right? So we could see meditation as a form of indirect breathing exercise, where you're sitting there and you're slowing down your breath, you're making the exhale longer, you're breathing less, and you're breathing through, the nose and the diaphragm. You're also relaxing yourself, lowering your stress, which is going to carry over to your stress levels, your cortisol levels on average throughout the day as well. The next day, a week from now, if you're doing it every day for, let's say, 10 minutes, that's what I would recommend at least. That's Shinzen Young's recommendation, by the way. He's a great monk. And my point is that if you're more relaxed because of the meditation, if you remember what I talked about earlier, the more stressed you are, the less likely you are to breathe correctly. So anything that lowers your stress will be better in terms of you being able to breathe more correctly. And the more conscious you are of your breath, the more you'll be able to breathe correctly, because the more you'll remember it, right? If you're unconscious of your breath, obviously you're not thinking about your breath. So that's why meditation is extra important in terms of this overall video, because unless you remember, you cannot really change your habits. It's like mewing. If you've ever tried to correct your tongue posture, which I had to do when I was 16, approximately, you remember your tongue all the time until, now I just do it naturally. It's the same thing with the breathing. You have to keep your attention on it. How about the Wim Hof method? Well, I don't like it. That's the thing. Why? You may know that Jack Kruse has spoken about it in many podcasts. He likes the cold part, I like the cold part as well, but he doesn't like the breathing part. And so, at first glance, I went to my experience and said, okay, so I used to do it a while ago, maybe 5-6 years ago, and what I noticed was that I was getting tinnitus. My ears were ringing afterwards, and I wasn't feeling good on it. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, you do the breathing research, you do the research for this video, or you just listen to it, and what happens is that you realize, okay, so we begin with hyperventilation. That's, if you don't know about the breathing, here's how it is. You do hyperventilation, you're taking basically 30 very large inhales, okay? So what's that doing? You're expelling a lot of CO2 and you're increasing your oxygen levels. So you're abusing the Bohr effect once again, and you're creating hypoxia. That's why breathing really quickly or hyperventilating makes you lightheaded, because you're starving your brain of oxygen. And then you're holding your breath, allowing your mitochondria to use up the oxygen that you've built up, and you're just creating a bunch of CO2. And that's why you can hold your breath for so long. So, to me, it's pointless, because there are better methods to achieve hypoxia, which is this sort of, you could say, eustress, so a positive stress that you can create to improve mitochondrial function, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Before we continue to Breathholds, we need to talk a little bit about stress, okay? People think that stress is either good or bad. What I'm about to tell you is that stress, as I learned, I'm very grateful to have learned this from a friend of mine, is neither good or bad. It's a neutral term. It was always used as a neutral term. The bad stress is called distress, and the good stress is called eustress. Now let's talk about a good stress, gravity. That's a stress. Why? It forces your muscles to work constantly. Even when you're sleeping, they need to work to maintain the skeletal system in general. There is always stress on you, some kind of stress, but we are adapted to this form of stress. Our skeletal systems need it, and if you remove gravity, you get issues. You might be, let's say, in need of less energy production. Some people, some very old people, might actually be able to rest better without gravity. But the fact of the matter is that we're built for gravity, and we need it to maintain our bone density. That is the case. And so that's a eustress. Now let's say you're a baby and you cry a lot. Why? Because you have no pain tolerance. Every experience is very traumatic to you. Any form of suffering is very traumatic to you. But as you experience things over and over again as a child, you suddenly realize that these things it's not a big deal. And this is called maturity. You maturing, becoming less emotionally reactive, brings you freedom. Now, did you have to go through a stage of stress? Yes. From our perspective, as adults, we could call this eustress, because we know that a child who will create a lot of suffering for themselves just because of the way the brain works and the world is, they'll need to have to go through this to become a well-functioning adult, right? So that's a eustress. Now, is there distress? Yes. If a wolf bites you, a dog bites you, I don't know, a lion is running after you, I don't think that's very beneficial in terms of the human experience. Or let's say losing a limb, for example, having an accident. All that is distress. All that is bad. So, how do we approach this from a health perspective? Usually when we speak of stress, in terms of a health perspective, there's a sweet spot. There's a spot where our bodies will recover, will adapt, and will become stronger. It becomes a eustress. If you push it too much, it becomes a distress. So there's a sweet spot, and that sweet spot, if you observe yourself doing something over and over again, and you see yourself getting stronger, and you feel healthier, and you know, your blood markers look good, then it is very safe to assume that it's a eustress, especially if other people are doing it as well and benefiting. But let's say you get bad results from it, at least the way you are doing it, it's probably a distress. Maybe you need to do less of it. Maybe you needed to do more of it. Maybe you didn't feel anything. Maybe you needed to do more of it. You see? So it's not a good or bad thing. It's a situation-dependent thing. It's a dose-dependent thing. Not everyone needs the same stress. Not every stress is going to be a eustress for every single person. And not every dose is going to be a eustress for every single person. You have to figure out what is a eustress. And we try to do that based on observation and based on the knowledge we can gain from others. What I want to discuss now in terms of breath holds is intermittent hypoxia, because that is really what we're doing when we're doing breath holds. We are creating hypoxia. We're creating an oxygen deficiency for a very short period of time, relatively speaking. So intermittent hypoxia, we're creating an oxygen deficiency for a little while. What happens when we do this? Naturally, we have genes to handle stuff that happens in the environment. One of the things that can occur is hypoxia. And then, for that, we can't just shut down immediately. We need some kind of cellular adaptation to deal with that short term. So how do we do that? Well, it's a gene called HIF1, and what you produce is HIF1A, alpha and beta. So these two guys, they increase during hypoxia, and they bind to the nucleus in certain places in the nucleus, and they start producing things that change how the cell works. They produce new proteins that are normally not there to change how the mitochondria work and how the cell works in a low oxygen environment. So when this happens, obviously if it happens for a long time, eventually you die. You can't be hypoxic for too long. But if you get a little bit of hypoxia, if you do a little bit of intermittent hypoxia, reduce the oxygen levels, and you activate HIF1, what happens is that you get adaptations that make the cell stronger. And there is now scientific evidence showing that this is the case. And it's absolutely amazing. You get a lot of the things we've actually discussed. You get more ATP production, or just better energy production in general. You get better efficiency as well. Better energy efficiency in the mitochondria. You get more mitogenesis, which is you creating new mitochondria, and you get mitophagy, which if you've watched the cold exposure video, you know that that is the process where we're clearing out our bad mitochondria. Because again, when the cell splits, it's just taking random mitochondria to each side. And so one cell might get good mitochondria, one cell might get bad mitochondria. We want to make sure, and again, we're under cell division all the time, so you really want to make sure that you have no bad mitochondria. They need to be cut out, because otherwise when this bad cell divides, it will just have bad mitochondria. So whenever these cells divide, you're just going to have bad mitochondria there. You never want that to happen, so you need to make sure you clear out all your bad mitochondria, and this is just one way of doing it. The study I'm showing on the screen also showed that you get better antioxidant activity, and you also get better resilience. The mitochondria become more resilient to stressors. And that's always a good thing, because now your colony is more resistant to damage, which means that they function better now than they did before, which is a great thing, isn't it? But the thing that people talk about the most in terms of breath holds is stem cell and growth hormone release. So there's stem cell release and there is growth hormone release when you do intermittent hypoxia. And, you know, people pay a lot of money for both of those. And there are benefits to both of those. And you can get them through intermittent hypoxia. That's what I'm trying to tell you. So yeah, try it out and see if it works. Now shifting back to the breathwork stuff, obviously breath holds are a part of breathwork. So you could do breath holds, and that, in my opinion, is the best alternative to Wim Hof breathing. Because instead of the hyperventilation in the beginning, which essentially fulfills no function, you can just hold immediately on the exhale and get the benefits of reduced breathing, higher CO2 levels, and intermittent hypoxia, which I think is a much, much better deal. So how would I do this? Well, let's look at the man himself, what he has written, Dr. Jack Kruse. Dr. Jack Kruse put out a tweet where he was talking about how if you do 60 to 90 second breath holds on the exhale, so not the inhale. You don't want to inhale and hold, you want to do it on exhale, just like when you're doing the control pause. You do 60 to 90 seconds, and this isn't the control pause, this is you holding it, so you can hold longer beyond when you want to take the first breath, as long as you get no symptoms, as long as you know you have no cardiovascular issues. So then you rest, and then you do that 3 times over, and you do it in UVA. It's very important to be in a good light environment when you're doing this, as the light environment controls what your mitochondria do way more than any other factor in our environment. Okay? So, he's saying be in UVA when doing this because the combination of intermittent hypoxia together with the UVA is basically a double whammy that enhances the effects of the intermittent hypoxia. Because with intermittent hypoxia, you hear, okay, stem cells, growth hormone, that has to do with regeneration, right? What is it that drives regeneration in humans? If you've studied Dr. Jack Kruse's work, you know that it's UV and infrared light. And you need to read The Body Electric by Dr. Robert O'Becker, to know why that is. Now it's time to step beyond breathing itself. What is it that influences the mitochondria? The environment. And will that influence how much CO2 and oxygen you create? Yes, it definitely will. So let's say I put you in the sun. Let's say you're in the sun. You think your mitochondria will work better or worse? They'll work better. They'll absolutely work better because they have many, many parts that are absorbing the light, and the absorption of this light directly gives energy to the mitochondria. It gives them more electrons to work with. It gives them more efficiency within the system. For example, red light, infrared light, makes the ATP synthase, your spinning hydrogen gun, 100% efficient. It creates 100% efficiency within this nanomotor. If there's no red light, you don't have that efficiency. And red light penetrates all throughout the body. Scott Zimmerman is an amazing resource for this, and thankfully I have an interview with him on my channel. And basically, if you're not exposed to infrared light, if you're not in the sun, you get tons of issues because you're not producing melatonin in the mitochondria. And, you know, what did we describe earlier? We described the electron transport chain. So that means that electrons are being transported down a chain, and that is intimately related to how we create energy in the cell. And so if you can improve the way the electrons move in the mitochondria, or if you can have more electrons that are also functioning well, they're going in the right place, then you're going to have greater energy production and greater energy efficiency. Red light does this. Red light from the sun does this. So the sun is probably the best thing you can do for your mitochondria. I can't think of anything that would be greater. Now, that's just red light. Then you've got all the other wavelengths, including UV, which does some absolutely amazing things with melanin. Okay? UV and infrared, those are magical. If you get into Dr. Jack Kruse's work, you're gonna find out a lot about those. They are very special, and the benefits they have on human beings and life in general, absolutely amazing. So, what we are concluding here is that the sun makes our mitochondria more efficient, right? That seems to be the case. Otherwise, red light therapy would not make the mitochondria more efficient. There are tons of studies on red light therapy. And again, the best red light therapy comes from the sun. So, I don't think that's anything controversial. Now, the mitochondria are creating more energy, okay? So that must mean that we're consuming more oxygen and we're producing more CO2, right? So you being in the sun raises your CO2 levels. Without us changing your breathing, you're just doing something healthy, and that's raising your CO2 levels and preventing, thus, hypoxia, right? You don't get hypoxic. The electron transport chain is moving well, because of many, many different factors, but one of them is the sun, of course. So that's one. Now let's say you do cold exposure. Will the same thing happen? Will the same phenomena occur? Yes. Yes, they will. It's the same thing. So what if you don't have any sun, and you're in a high EMF environment, and you're trying to protect your mitochondria? What do? Well, you do cold exposure. I've made an entire video about cold exposure, but one of the reasons why it's gonna help is because EMF causes hypoxia, because it makes your mitochondria work less efficiently. It does the opposite of what the sun does, and so you're gonna lower your CO2 levels. And cold exposure increases your CO2 levels. Okay, and this is a very, very basic way of looking at it. It's not the full picture. But it is one way of preventing hypoxia. Cold exposure is going to oxygenate your tissues better. That is going to be the case because you're making your mitochondria work in a better manner and you're raising your CO2 levels. You're using the Bohr effect to help yourself. Now let's go to nutrition, which is going to have less of an effect than these two in total. But can it have a huge effect as well? Yes. If you eat fat as opposed to carbohydrates, especially during the winter, what's going to happen? You're going to produce more CO2 and you're going to produce more water. And so, okay, we're back to CO2 again. Eating fat produces more CO2. So this means that eating fat can prevent hypoxia as well. Now, is that the full picture? No, it's all of these things in your environment influencing CO2. So what am I trying to tell you? Outside of breathing, these two, oxygenation and then CO2 levels, they're a sign of mitochondrial health. They're a sign, they're a reflection. Your CO2 levels on a blood test, that is a reflection of your overall environment, how well that is. And of course, I told you your environment determines how well your mitochondria are going to work. So that means that CO2 is also a reflection of how well your mitochondria are working. Because if your CO2 levels are really low, you're not creating a lot of energy, are you? Maybe that's why you had digestive issues and the brain fog and your skin issues and whatnot. Sleep issues, insomnia, signaling issues, autoimmune. Anything you can imagine, really. Well, if your CO2 levels were higher, your mitochondria would probably function, and all these mitochondrial diseases that we see in modern society, maybe they are always present in people with low CO2 levels because it's just a consequence of having bad mitochondria, right? So now, with that in mind, do you understand what Buteyko was doing? He was influencing one factor of these people's environment because, again, your breathing is a part of your environment. He was taking that factor and using it to influence the CO2 levels to prevent the hypoxia that their overall environment was creating. Now, sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't do that. He was doing this back in the 50s and 60s in Siberia. I don't think the EMF was really high. I think a lot of things back then were a lot healthier than what we'd see now. People were more on the countryside as opposed to cities, although it was already pretty bad in the 50s and 60s. Nowadays, you're probably gonna need to do more. You're probably gonna need to fix your tech abuse. But can changing your breathing help? Absolutely. What I'm trying to say is that when you're sitting in your room under artificial light, when it's dark outside, and you're on your desktop computer with a screen on that's shining even more blue light on you, and you're sitting in a strong electric field, you're absolutely murdering your mitochondria. What's happening is that you're reducing your melatonin levels. This is increasing the amount of electrons that are going through the electron transport chain, but they can't get to the end. And so this shifts the ratio of something called NAD plus to NADH. Basically, you want to have a high ratio. You want to have more NAD plus to NADH. If you have a lot of NADH and less NAD plus, this means you have a lot of electrons that aren't going through really the electron transport chain. This produces a lot of reactive oxygen species, and this is also a shift that causes you to activate HIF1, which we discussed earlier, which is the system that works in the cell when there isn't enough oxygen. But there is enough oxygen, but you're activating the system anyway. So what happens is that you get pseudo-hypoxia. And not only that, the blue light also gives you the wrong spectrum. Okay, so the sun is what we're designed for. No one can argue with that. We are absolutely 100% designed for the sun, and this is what's optimal for human beings. If you have a standard white LED, it's not that the light is blue, it's that it has too much blue. And that's why the color temperature is that way, and not like the sun, which is more yellow, because this is a different blend of colors. There are also a bunch of colors that you can't see, like infrared and UV that come from the sun, that you absolutely do not have in indoor lighting. Now what happens is that obviously you understand that the sun has a bunch of biological effects on you, right? Well, why would you assume that any light, whatever light it is, doesn't? You assume that the red light therapy lamp will have certain therapeutic effects on you. You assume that the sun will create vitamin D and do other things. Some of them we've discussed today. But some people do not assume that that light they're turning on in the kitchen to see, or in the room, or from their screen doesn't have any effects. It has huge effects. And what happens is that you don't have any infrared, right? You don't have enough red, you don't have any UV, but you have a lot of blue, and what the blue does is it is absorbed by certain parts of the mitochondria. So we talked about this chain, right? Here in the fourth complex, this is where oxygen goes and creates water. In these, some of these absorb blue light, and so they work better, but they create certain things, free radicals, that sit in the fourth complex, go to the fourth complex and harm it. So now this guy no longer works, and what happens? The electrons stall, and you just break the entire mitochondria. Your overall CO2 levels also go down, so you affect the rest of the system as well. So remember, isolated and primitive tribes, they don't have any artificial light, they don't have any cell towers around them. That is how it's supposed to be. These things harm us drastically. Remember, there's always something you can do. Even if you're in a bad environment and you're forced to be in a bad environment, you can always change your breathing. If it's winter and you have no sunlight, you can always utilize cold exposure, and you can always do these breathing sessions. You can also eat seasonally and locally, which makes it so that you optimize yourself for the environment that you're in. You're able to tolerate the cold better, your mitochondria are able to function in your environment, you're able to function in the cold in a better manner, you produce more heat, so you're good. You also have lower deuterium levels, but that's something we discussed in the skin video, in the acne and skin video. That's more of the deuterium stuff. It's very important. You can also watch my interview with Dr. Laszlo Boros. He's an deuterium expert. But deuterium is a very important topic to understand in terms of health as well, because many of the things that we're discussing, the bad stuff, they increase deuterium levels, or they make it so that we can't deplete deuterium, while the good stuff depletes deuterium. Deuterium is a mitochondrial toxin, but you also need it. It occurs in nature and you need it in the appropriate amount that's found in your environment. Lastly, I'd like to speak about something I learned from Dr. Jack Kruse when listening to a podcast where he was speaking about breathing. And in this podcast, he was talking about how many people do reduced breathing, but they do it in the wrong environment. So now we're going to bring both sides together. Let's say you're in a blue lit environment and you're creating this hypoxia and you're reducing your melatonin levels and you're just creating chaos. Is it a good idea to breathe less than when you're already hypoxic? Maybe not. Maybe not. It may be the case, but it may not be the case. Probably depends on the factors that are present in your environment. But to keep it safe, I would just breathe normally. Diaphragm, nose, don't try any air hunger, okay? If you're outside in the sun and you're most likely not hypoxic, probably a good idea to do some reduced breathing, breathholds. This is a good environment to do it in because your mitochondria are working well here, and so you tampering with your engines, with your machinery, is not going to be a very big risk. It's like you learning how to fix your car or change your car with a master mechanic beside you, doing it with you, helping you, as opposed to you doing it yourself and you know nothing about cars. That's really the difference we're talking about here. So that's one, and then the second environment where it would be appropriate is in complete darkness, because again, light has massive effects on our mitochondria, and if it's completely dark, that is an environment that's fine because it's also natural. It's devoid of light. There's no light, which is, you're still mimicking the natural environment of a human being. You have sun in one of them, and then you have a lack of sun, which is the night. So if you're in a dark room, it sort of mimics the same thing, although you have to make sure that there's enough infrared in the environment, because even at night in nature, you have tons of infrared. Okay, so as long as you have a good light environment, these exercises are very good to do. And again, this ultimately means that if you're in the sun, or you do cold exposure, or you do any of these things that help out your mitochondria, you will gain greater CO2 tolerance, you will gain greater respiratory function, you will gain all these benefits that we've spoken about. But what I want you to realize, and this is sort of my point about repeat earlier, you can influence all these things just by breathing as well. And that is why Buteyko is even able to have these results with people. That is why people see these drastic results when they change their breathing and they normalize it by increasing their CO2 levels. It's because you can drastically influence your mitochondria just by changing the way you breathe. And that, I want you to see breathing as one part that's influencing something that's being influenced by your entire environment, whether you're in the sun or artificial light, whether you're eating pineapples in Costa Rica or Norway, whether you're doing any of these things that might be healthy or unhealthy. Remember that this system that's we think is mainly regulated by breathing is actually regulated by the mitochondria. And what you're doing when you're breathing is you're changing the way the mitochondria work. And you can either do it in a positive way or a negative way. Go and achieve excellent health. I know you can do it.